Thank you, Mike. I'm delighted to be here at home in the South, back to an unhurried pace with gracious, friendly people. You may have heard the story of 4 guys walking down the street. One is from New York City, one is from Saudi Arabia, one is from Russia, and one is from North Korea. A reporter rushes up. He says, "Excuse me, could I get your opinion of the meat shortage?" The person from Saudi Arabia says, "Shortage? What's a shortage?" The person from Russia says, "Meat? What's meat?" The person from North Korea says, "Opinion? What's an opinion?" And the person from New York City says, "Excuse me? What's excuse me?" Anyway, I am delighted to be back in Nashville and back at Vanderbilt to talk about a tale of 4 cities. What does make for urban success? Healthy families, is it good schools, affordable homes, strong marriages, high bond ratings, honest government, total size, growth rate. Boston's gloating now because they think it's going to be World Series victories and maybe even Super Bowl champions. Whatever. For the past century, the American nation has been tilting south and west. And we see this in the rise of places like Los Angeles and San Diego and Phoenix and Las Vegas and Tucson and El Paso. Much of that growth has taken place in what we think of as the traditional South. And looking at the United States in 1900 and again in 1950, we could have said or predicted some few places in the South or the Mid-South or the Southeast are going to become great cities. What I intend to do in the short time available here is to talk about Houston and New Orleans and Memphis and Nashville. Obviously leaving out some important candidates, Dallas, and Atlanta, and Miami, or Charlotte, and many other places. Well, what do we see as we do this? And just quickly look at the chart, and we could see that in our time, Houston is far and away the most important of these 4 cities, at least as measured in total size. And New Orleans in this particular slide is a little bit distorted by the results of Katrina, but let's look at it from 1900 to 2000, focusing on the first and second to last digit, and you see Nashville with 80,000 people in 1900, the 47th largest in the United States. Memphis, 25% larger, the 37th. Houston, not even on the chart of the top 100 cities in the United States. In New Orleans, 12th largest city in the country. But then if we move over to the 2000, we see Nashville has jumped up, partly because of its merger with Davidson County. Memphis at number 18. Houston is the number 4 largest city and no doubt will be 3 shortly as it's overtaking Philadelphia and then New Orleans, which has fallen off the charts just about in the other direction now. And I'll be talking about the homicide rates just in a minute. But in 1900, as I say, New Orleans is easily the largest and most important city in the South. Memphis second, Nashville third, and Houston not even there. As early as 1950, Houston had shot forward. New Orleans was still second. Memphis was more distant, and Nashville was last. By our time, Houston has become certainly a major regional metropolis, if not a world city. New Orleans and Memphis have become the 2 poorest metropolitan regions in the United States. Compared to their rivals, they have not attracted enough new, ambitious young people. Let me say a word about New Orleans to begin with. The city you're familiar with, called the Crescent City, at a bend of the Mississippi River, in some ways an incredible location. We're the largest and most important river in North America reaches the sea. Actually, it doesn't quite reach the sea there. There's a delta out there. But nevertheless, if you were to look at a map in 1850 or 1900 and say, where in the United States is there likely to be a great city to rise, New Orleans would certainly be high on your list. The Battle of New Orleans there in 1815 was an early indication of the importance of the city. It becomes a huge port there on the Mississippi River with the invention of the steamboat. There it is with Canal Street, the major street coming into the Mississippi River. By 1860, the rise of the cotton economy, and especially those steamboats going up and down the river, had made New Orleans one of the 5 largest cities in the United States, and at least allegedly the wealthiest. That's what they say in New Orleans. After the Civil War, it began a long and slow, at least relative, decline. It imported very little through the Port of New Orleans. It's mostly an export center. It was bypassed by the major railroads. There's a railroad there now. You can take the Crescent City, but it developed. Of course, over the years, it's done a lot of wonderful things. Many creative people have been born there. Important businesses developed there. If you go to the World War II Museum, the Higgins boats, which were the landing craft at D-Day. And of course, everyone's familiar with jazz and the rise of jazz. These are old slave quarters in New Orleans, and it's always had a large African-American population. And in this, now a different neighborhood, but Storyville, which was a kind of red light district in New Orleans, is where kind of the blues and jazz first developed, and many people think that's America's greatest contribution to culture. New Orleans, however, is mostly not a successful city. Here are steamboats in the 1890s. As you know, New Orleans has become, even before Katrina, a city divided between rich and poor. As I said, the poorest metropolitan region in the United States. No new industry has developed in New Orleans in the last half century. Many people, including me, would like to see New Orleans rise back to its former glory. My best friend lives there, and so I visit it often. But New Orleans has a number of problems that have emerged in recent years. I mean, the public consciousness has emerged in recent years. These are shotgun houses. It's also inexpensive homes, transformed houses in New Orleans. A typical shotgun, as you know, is the house where the rooms are really no foundation there. The idea was you could put a shotgun in the front door and blow it through the whole back of the house, and thus the term, and the built environment. But of course, shipbuilding and industry was important there. These slides don't translate easily to PowerPoint, but the cranes, the ships moving back and forth. On the far left, you don't see it again with the transition to PowerPoint, but the tall buildings of New Orleans on the Mississippi River as it bends. The barge traffic at the end of the Mississippi River stack up down there at the waterway there. Of course, the whole point of a river port is the transfer of goods from one form of conveyance to another. Obviously, those barges on which goods float down the Mississippi River are not going to be adequate to get into the Gulf of Mexico or the oceans, and so they have to be reloaded in the New Orleans area. And of course, it still has one of the most charming transit systems anywhere in the United States. That's the St. Charles Trolley, actually still not running again after Katrina. But what I want to just mention about New Orleans, because what I really want to talk about today and to come back to is the importance of history, the importance of public policy, and the importance of toleration are kind of my 3 main messages. New Orleans is annually among the most dangerous cities in the United States, and that's to put the nicest possible face on it. Actually, it's now the most dangerous city in the United States. Its homicide rate has lately been running out of sight because even though the population is down by 50%, they had 6 murders there in one evening not so long ago. It's a community with considerable housing and drug and poverty problems, but that's really no excuse. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the second issue is corruption. One need not study American cities very long to realize that almost every place has been embarrassed at one time or another by the personal malfeasance of public officials. But corruption in New Orleans and actually in Louisiana is on a different level than in the rest of the United States. It's not only higher, it's been more deeply entrenched into the culture. So you could say it's not so much the exception in New Orleans, but the expectation. And thirdly, and most importantly, and I'm giving a lot of editorials here this evening, is that New Orleans needs to be more open. More residents remain in that city than in the other metropolitan region. More people from New Orleans come back to it. But such statistics mask an unpleasant reality. Fresh ideas and diverse ethnic groups do not find a supportive environment in New Orleans. Most of the cities in the United States that have prospered in the United States since 1980, Houston, Las Vegas, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, share a common characteristic. They attract large numbers of immigrant families. Miami is more than 60% foreign-born. Los Angeles has millions of Chicanos and immigrants from various parts of Asia. New York City has 3 million legal immigrants, not counting all the illegals in Queens and other places. Chicago has a Mexican concentration now numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But Mexicans have avoided New Orleans, which is closer by a long shot to Mexico than Chicago. Similarly, Jews, Russians, Greeks, Muslims, Latinos, Chinese, and Koreans lack a historic presence in New Orleans. The only significant immigrant group there is from Vietnam, and they are the shrimp fishermen who have felt their way into New Orleans from lower down the Mississippi River. That the Crescent City does not attract persons from other countries is serious because immigrants have provided the energy and money to rehabilitate and to re-energize neighborhoods and towns across the United States. More interestingly, and I think interesting for this group, is New Orleans is closed at the top, the most closed city in the United States. Essentially, there is nothing a person can do from the outside to join the New Orleans elite. You can't contribute $25 million to the New Orleans Symphony or Art Museum, if they had one worthy of the name, and move into the elite. Neither can you do anything to drop out of the elite in New Orleans. They have a society page there every day. They list not only the details about the bride, but the bride's mother, including her maiden name. Great attention is devoted every year to Mardi Gras, and the business leadership of the city, all male, spends about 2 months trying to decide who will be king of Rex and queen of the carnival. In general, persons who are energetic and ambitious and starting out have little incentive to move to New Orleans. Contrast this with other cities and the enormous creation of wealth that has taken place there. Newcomers abound in other cities. Think about the opportunities in so many places for these new people from China, from South America, from Eastern Europe. By the same token, as I said, you can drop out of the social elite in other cities. Houston has many societies that celebrate the Mayflower, the American Revolution, or 100 similar events. But those groups are largely irrelevant in Houston. Houston's social mores are dictated by its movers and shakers, not its has-beens. In New Orleans, the elite has no money and no incentive to donate to local cultural institutions, which are, of course, impoverished. The closed situation is just accepted. This is simply the way it has been for more than a century. I said this to an audience even larger than this at the LSU School of Architecture a few years ago. Not one person came up to me afterwards to say, "What are you at least now a Yankee doing, come up and say this about New Orleans, because I said, you're not going to get a job as an architect in New Orleans. You're going to have to go to Houston, most likely. And it's also telling, and since we're here at Vanderbilt, it seems to me that 50 years ago, that Rice and Duke and Vanderbilt and Emory and Tulane were, give or take, on the same level. Tulane has dropped out of that list. I think it's got something to do. It hasn't raised money. It hasn't raised its profile. Houston, by the way, this is in relative terms, relative to Vanderbilt, just for example. Let me say a word about Houston. This is downtown New Orleans. This is Canal Street, looking toward the Mississippi River. And here's Houston in the 1880s, an old city, but not a particularly important one, and shares most of New Orleans' disadvantages. You'd say, but what about it? It's in a swamp. It's in the path of hurricanes. It's below sea level. Well, so is Houston in the path of hurricanes, and so is it in a swamp. In fact, it's interesting, they've kind of killed this term, but for a long time it was known as the Bio City because of all its low lying. And it's hot and humid in Houston too. But Houston has taken off, and one could say that in 1900, New Orleans barely knew Houston was there. In 2007, Houston barely knows New Orleans is there. It's a not particularly important suburb of New Orleans at this time. Of Houston at this time. It was formed in 1837 on Buffalo Bayou, which is not a very impressive body of water. After the fall of the Alamo, the critical battle of the Mexican-American War was fought there. It later became the home of many oil refineries and petrochemicals. And of course, they built the Houston Ship Channel, which is perhaps the most polluted waterway in the United States, but generates a lot of money. New Orleans really took the energy industry away from New Orleans. It wasn't all in New Orleans, but a big percentage of it was 50, 40 years ago. Now it's all moved to Houston. There are lots of platforms, oil rigs off the New Orleans coast, but now they report to Houston companies. The Texas Medical Center is the largest in the world, all created there near downtown Houston. A lot of it else has been done with federal dollars. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. There's no more logic that NASA should be in Houston than it should be in Vermont or Montana. But Lyndon Johnson was one of his first efforts as Vice President of the United States, got it moved to Houston. And of course, it's also well known for its rejection of zoning. They rejected it initially as a communist plot in 1948, and then stayed with that opinion in 1962 and again in 1993. But in so many ways, it has been progressive. It elected its first female mayor, Catherine Whitmire, in 1981. It entered into a severe depression in the late 70s and early 1980s with the collapse of the oil business. But Houston, entrepreneurial, energetic, looking toward the future, overcame it. And now it's home of the Jesse Jones Hall for Performing Arts, a rising symphony orchestra, a wonderful art gallery, and Rice University has many times the money of Tulane. The story of Houston, I would suggest, is ambition and greed, but in a good sense. It's led to openness and toleration. Achievement is the coin of the realm in Houston. Let me say a word. Let me just show you a couple more things. This is hand-operated semaphores. I'm sorry about those white splotches on. But here's an interesting picture. Galveston. In 1900, Galveston was the important city, and Houston was the minor city nearby. But as you know, the great Galveston hurricane, I want to say 1906, in many ways the worst natural disaster in American history, probably before Katrina, blew through town and practically blew Galveston away. And Houston built what you see there is that Houston Ship Channel with your taxpayer dollars, which has made Houston one of the leading ports in the world. Here we are as early as the 1960s, looking at mostly new skyscrapers and parking lots, and it's 2 or 3 times that size today. It has one of the earliest elite in-town shopping malls called the Galleria in Houston. Many of you no doubt been there. But you see pockets in Houston all over the place, as you often do in Los Angeles. This is from the Galleria. It's not a great image, but they invented the kind of entertainment idea inside the complex long before the Mall of America or the one in Edmonton. And of course, it's a different kind of city. The top image is of Fifth Avenue in New York, which is obviously crowded, congestion. And Houston's got, 16-lane freeways through downtown, but nevertheless, it's prospered a great deal. And this is, I wish it was a better image. It looks like it's an overgrown antebellum mansion. But actually, it's an inner city Houston community called River Oaks, which is one of America's finest inner city residential neighborhoods. Well, let me say a word about Memphis, my hometown, as you probably picked up on which I want to say a little bit more about. Founded on the Mississippi River Bluff, so it's called the Bluff City, and the bluffs aren't that impressive, but it's impressive enough for water, so almost all of Arkansas will flood before Memphis will. Established in 1819 and incorporated in 1826. When you think of its critical dates, there was a big Civil War naval battle there under the bluffs. But the key date in Memphis history is probably the yellow fever epidemics of 1873 and especially 1878, which really killed off the diversity in the city that had been Germans and Irish. The Irish did not have the money to leave, and they died. 90% of them, something like that. The Germans kind of temporarily got out of town. And then when they came back, they decided not to stay, and they removed themselves to Cincinnati or St. Louis. The charter of Memphis was revoked for a few years between 1879 and 1891. The city did continue to grow, however, in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was the center of the cotton trade in the United States. It's in the middle, it's very, well, Tennessee is 3 real different states, and Memphis is the Black Belt. It's really the capital of Mississippi and Arkansas in many ways. Big hardwood flooring operations there. Major Ford Motor Company plant when I was growing up, RCA, Buckeye, Cotton Oil. A big distribution center because it's both on the Mississippi River and interstates interact there. Those of you who've been around a while will remember the name Boss Crump. E.H. Crump was one of really America's 3 most powerful bosses. The other was the Pendergast machine in Kansas City, and Frank, his nickname was I Am the Law Hague in Jersey City. Crump was an incredibly powerful individual, used to almost control Tennessee politics because Shelby County would report the last as the voting returns would come in across Tennessee, and they'd kind of see what they needed. But I'm not making this number up. I remember one election where the guy who was leading for governor was leading coming into Shelby County, and the other candidate, I think Gordon Browning was on one end of that, had 50. The guy who was leading had 861 votes or something like that. The other one was 59,000 and something. So, you get a 60,000 vote margin in a vote of 60,000. It's essentially all one thing, and you could see its influence on the state of Tennessee. I was an Estes Kefauver scholar at the University of Memphis a long time ago, and Estes Kefauver was running for senator, and Crump said something to the effect about Kefauver being a pet coon and stealing stuff in United. Kefauver was clever enough to put a coonskin hat on his head and say, I may be a coon, but I'm not Boss Crump's pet coon, or something like that. Anyway, he went on to fame and fortune. But Memphis did have an awful lot going for it. It was in some ways a music city before Nashville was. It was W.C. Handy, the great black composer. It was in some ways the home of the blues. Even though it was in Mississippi, it migrated up to Memphis. Later, Elvis Presley obviously was from Memphis, and his home Graceland has become a big tourist site. And Beale Street, in many ways, the most famous street associated with African American history in the period in the United States. More than 125th Street or 63rd in Harlem or 63rd Street in Chicago. And then Danny Thomas chose it as the location for St. Jude's Research Hospital, which has become quite an extraordinary institution in the last 30 years. But Memphis has been in, I think, relative decline since 1900. And now it's characterized by high crime and high minority population, low property values, low percentages of foreign-born, very low population density. Thought I'd just say a word about this. Ed Crump, in some ways quiet. He made Memphis quiet. You'd pay a big fine if you blew your horn and you weren't about to have a wreck. It's clean. It's got an award as America's cleanest city many times. He made it no longer America's murder capital, which it had been earlier in the century. And even African Americans could vote. And they were told how to vote. But that's a big step up from some counties in West Tennessee that weren't Shelby and nearby Mississippi counties where you couldn't. But it was an atmosphere of coercion and fear, and a very weak tradition in Memphis of creative or public-spirited leadership. And this tradition, I think, this is an editorial, unfortunately, continues with the Ford family and now Willie Harrington corruption. But it's not just E.H. Crump's failure or black leadership more recently. There's been a leadership failure that goes back for many decades in Memphis. After Brown versus Board of Education called for the integration, or at least no longer the forced separation of the races, in 1954, we remember that this problem was not solved. No place was successful. But after Brown versus Board of Education, some of you may recall the fight at Little Rock Central High School in 1957, or the Birmingham demonstrations and Police Commissioner Bull Connors releasing police dogs on the demonstrators. America was really at a fork in the road, and many southern cities were at that fork, because you looked at Birmingham and you looked at Little Rock. In Atlanta, the white business leadership got together with the black political leadership in a Rome and more or less decided this is going to be the city too busy to hate. Now, it may be a lot of hokum, but it's sold, and it continues to sell. And Atlanta has been a city that's more or less avoided so many of these other issues because they came together and tried to solve the problem. Look at Memphis, which, by the way, had been about the same size as Atlanta in 1940. It's complicated, and I don't mean to make it uncomplicated, but when Edmund Orgel decided not to run again for mayor in 1959, and he was a bit of a more moderate in Memphis terms then. Two people took over in Memphis, Henry Loeb, who became mayor, and I remember watching. He was tall and handsome and easy to vote for, and then Claude Armour, who was the tough police commissioner. Their response to the civil rights revolution in Memphis was to fight, not to compromise. Some of you may remember the garbage strike in Memphis in 1968. I think from a historical perspective, we could be pretty sure, even without knowing the details, that black sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968 were not overpaid. They had an argument. Henry Loeb did not want to listen to it. He wanted to refuse to compromise, refuse to listen, refuse to talk. As a result, there was a garbage strike. As a result, Martin Luther King came to Memphis. Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis. Time magazine the next week, in its description of the assassination, called, in a term that will never be forgotten in Memphis, a decaying river town. What if the Memphis political leadership had been a little more farsighted and reasonable? We could talk about a couple more towns in Memphis, but Memphis instead got racial violence. Patrons became fearful of downtown. The decline, when I was growing up, there were parades all the time in downtown. They ended. The big department stores, by the way, as they have in Nashville and most other cities, but Lowenstein's and Goldsmiths and Gerber's and Breeze, all closed. The Mid-American Mall failed. Partly a result of racial conflict, powerful business and real estate interests lost confidence in downtown Memphis. And by the late 1970s, they were concentrating on the eastern part of Shelby County. maybe part of it is that Memphis is up against a river and it can't grow on the other side because it's low, and Nashville can grow in essentially every direction. But the Boyle family, the Snowdens, the Morgans, they essentially abandoned the city of Memphis for its eastern suburbs. Because the most important families in Memphis began focusing on neighborhoods that may not mean anything to you. Let me just see if I've got the things here. Well, by the way, here's tunnel workers in Memphis and the Artesian Water Company. That date is wrong. It must be 1910. This is downtown Memphis in 1939. You can see the Mississippi River. And while you can't really see the elevation there, from the river to those buildings, I don't know, it could be 30 feet. 30 feet's a very, very long way if the river's rising. Memphis Union Station, now torn down, unlike Nashville's Union Station, which was not as big as this one, by the way, although it's pretty nice. Chickasaw Gardens, one of the most elegantly planned communities in Memphis. Now it's in the inner city, and there was a rape and murder there just within the last year that's hurt reputations in Memphis before. I mean, once again. But this was one of the many mansions on Union Avenue in town. But as the Memphis business and real estate elite began concentrating on White Station and Germantown, Memphis has a Germantown also, and Collierville, the infrastructure improvements in Shelby County began to, move out Walnut Grove and Popular to the east. Widen the roads, build schools, build sewers, build fire stations, do all these things, paid for by the public. No attention to history. Tear down this building, put up a Burger King instead. Forget about Overton Park, run an expressway through it. Crime goes up. And this is what I think is interesting. In 1960, Memphis was a huge medical center, much bigger than Nashville. Baptist Hospital in Memphis was the largest independent hospital in the United States, in the middle of the city. Methodist Hospital, almost as big, was next door. John Gaston Hospital was the kind of public hospital that was there as well. And then the University of Tennessee Medical School. Had all the ingredients of becoming what the Texas Medical Center became, or the Vanderbilt or the Nashville Medical Center. Or think of this, Birmingham, which was nowhere. Now the University of Alabama at Birmingham has a major medical presence in the center of Birmingham. And Birmingham has become, and Nashville, what Memphis could have been. Now what they did was to tear those hospitals down, at least Baptist, and move. Not thinking about Barnes Hospital in Washington University Hospital in St. Louis, or Massachusetts General in Harvard and Boston, or MD Anderson and Baylor and the Texas Medical Center in Houston, or Presbyterian Hospital in Columbia University in New York and Harlem, Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan, consistently ranked as the best cancer hospital in the United States, or Johns Hopkins. It'd be hard to find a more depressed inner city than Baltimore. But if you're dying of lung cancer, the question you want to ask yourself is not what's the neighborhood like, but who can possibly make me better? And so Johns Hopkins University, again, hospital is usually ranked number one in the United States. And most people who go there aren't interested in the neighborhood. They're interested in staying alive in a different way. But the Memphis hospitals moved out. They said those new way Elvis was declared dead was too old, it was too obsolete. What they really did was to move the hospitals where they'd be more convenient to the physicians and to their white patrons. What they didn't realize or seem not to care about is if you want to have a world-class medical center, you have to have concentration. You need a medical school, you need usually a public hospital, you need big private hospitals. They need to be together. And that's what the great hospitals in the United States, and Memphis let it go. I'm going to speed up because we want to have some questions. Memphis lost out on the Music Center with Presley. And if you saw the new movie about Johnny Cash, was it? Somebody knows the name of it. But in Memphis, there was Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, June Carter, all in Memphis in the 1950s. But Nashville became Music City. And very little industry in Memphis, and a lot of wasted energy on sports. If it were not for Fred Smith, who invented FedEx, and we won't talk about it, but which has 30,000 employees in Memphis, many of them highly paid pilots, the city would have blown away. What about Nashville? There's so many experts and residents here, I'm fearful to say anything about Nashville. And I won't cite the books, which many of you are familiar with. But I have visited often over the years, and sometimes I think it's somebody who's from somewhere else can see it more clearly. Who knows not England, who only England knows. Well, you all well know that Nashville grew up as a military and trade outpost on the banks of the Cumberland River in the late 18th century, incorporated in 1806, becomes the permanent capital of Tennessee in 1843. Major battle in the Civil War, the northern terminus of Natchez Trace. But one of the key dates in Nashville history, you know them better than I do. Of course, the state capitol is gigantic. The railroad, the L&N, and I think that renovation of Union Station is fabulous. The Bible industry, or the Bible, by which I mean the Baptist Sunday School Board, the Methodist Publishing, the Lifeway as a Baptist publisher, the founding of the Health Corporation of America, which not only brought money to the city from that, but I understand there are more than 300 separate companies that have been spawned by HCA and now in Middle Tennessee. The phenomenon of Opryland. Initially, I guess, the amusement park, and more recently a hotel. I think it's so tacky that it makes Las Vegas seem sophisticated. Well, listen, but it works. My sister comes up to Nashville every year to see the Christmas stuff there and to see its many displays. The merger of Nashville and Davidson County. I know it's not been perfect, and I know there have been issues. But when you look at the American context, that is an incredible statement. There are 15,000 school districts in the United States and only 3,000 counties. And all the other places which have a county this big, a city this big, have really essentially not merged. We could spend a lot of time on that one, but it's important. And it stands out in the United States. The birth of the automobile industry. We're really thinking about the death of the automobile industry, of course, except around here. First Nissan, which was then called Datsun, of course, and more recently General Motors and Spring Hill. And now the move of the Nissan headquarters from LA to Nashville. And I would say good government and honest government. Not to say there have not been problems in Nashville. It's had political bosses. Ben West and Beverly Briley probably get a lot of credit for the merging. But the contrast with Memphis and New Orleans in terms of political leadership is stark. And it's in Nashville's favor. And respect for the past here. Whereas Memphis tore down this Frank Hill mansion and many of these other tall buildings. By the way, the Sterritt building, the tallest building in Memphis, is empty. You could buy it for probably $500,000. Probably less, actually. You'd have a lot of money to spend before you could. That's a flood in Memphis. Memphis has flooded once or twice, but it's got that 1937 flood flooded the state of Mississippi, among other things. And this is more or less what, not just Memphis, too much of America sadly has become. Far out on the edges, a street that must be 200 feet wide, lined with big signs. And, that's an embarrassment to show anyone who's from Europe. Anyway, here's Nashville, obviously the Capitol Hill, and with the state capitol rising in the distance. The steamboats, the view, and there are Gaylord Enterprises there in the top. I'm sorry about those slides. But I think that the fact when Grand Ole Opry moved away from Ryman Auditorium and sat mostly empty for 20 years and deteriorated, at least it was renovated in 1994. There was a respect for the past. I think the way that the new housing stock integrates with the old in Germantown is quite wonderful. And the new Schermerhorn Symphony Center, which probably some architects don't love because it's not modern, but it fits in with the city. And I think the way it's across the street from the Country Music Hall of Fame in some ways represents in physical form what Nashville has done so well, which is to merge high culture and low culture or popular culture and do it pretty well so that the Athens of the South can also be comfortable with Music City. And the downtown revitalization, which I think is something you should be so pleased with. Partly built on the failure of the Central Business District after World War II, but now it's a wonderful collection of old commercial buildings. The downtown department stores have died here, as they have so many places, and Kane and Sloan and Harvey have been replaced by big malls in Cool Springs and Green Hills and Hickory Hollow. I think it was important to repeal, it's hard for me to believe there was ever a law, but there was in many cities, a law banning residents from the central business district. And that law was just repealed in the mid-1990s. Now, every city in the United States is falling all over itself, trying to get people to move into the center city. And downtown Nashville is doing that as fast as it's come, if it can. And I just mentioned to you a new book that's just out about Nashville, which is quite wonderful, by Craig Havighurst, called A Castle of the South, WSM. He argues that that radio station was central to the popularization of country music. And it spawned, as much as anything else, Nashville's reputation in the entertainment industry. It was really a radio station, but really they didn't care about the radio station. They cared about selling insurance. And it was the brainchild of a guy named Edward Craig, who probably is familiar to many of you, who owned a big piece of the Nashville-based National Life and Accident Insurance Company. So they bought the radio station as a way to sell insurance. And in their Saturday night programming gap, they decided to start a barn dance and program, and that became Grand Ole Opry. And hillbilly music and Ryman Auditorium and Roy Acuff and Hank Williams, who I believe was killed on January 1st, 1950, and then Minnie Pearl. Did you know that Howdy, how would she, I can't mimic how she said it. Howdy, about whatever. It was suggested by a New York City advertising agency. Her name wasn't Minnie Pearl, and they told her to do this, and she did it. But anyway, by 1960, Nashville had already surpassed Memphis with 160 song publishers and 15 recording studios. Let me end now just with this quick comment. What I'd like to leave you with, and so I think Nashville has replaced Memphis as the most dynamic and interesting and vital and future-oriented city in the state. But I'd like to leave you with just several ideas. One, the importance of history. Nothing just happened, whether it's WSM or something else. If you don't understand the past, you really can't make very many intelligent comments about the present or the future. The importance of decisions, especially public policy decisions, like the city-county merger in 1963. I would argue the importance of diversity and toleration and of attracting immigrants. The importance of the built environment. To respect what's already there, that's the legacy of our ancestors, and that will make a city in some ways to build around that and build the new buildings but save something. I think some cities have not done a good job of that. The importance of safety. Just to give you a strange comment. The Bronx, which is obviously not paradise to most people, has more residents than Nashville, Memphis, and New Orleans put together, and many fewer homicides. There is no excuse for a crime rate to be as high as it is in Nashville, or Memphis, or New Orleans, or anywhere else. I think after the example of New York City, you can essentially practically end crime as we know it. No one thinks about crime anymore in New York of any kind. The importance of public transit. Sadly, I think I've saw one bus since I've been in Nashville. That's slightly overstated, but to ride a bus in Nashville for most people is the same as hanging a sign around your neck that says, "I am a loser." You can't operate a new city like that. I'll come back to that in a minute. The importance of regional cooperation. Portland, Oregon, I think, is a sign of that, trying Minneapolis and St. Paul a little bit now. And there is a beginning of that here, the Mobility 2030 for Davidson County, the Cumberland region tomorrow, and the new effort by Professor Davis and others to revitalize Center City, and especially at the Civic Center. But finally, to say that the future of the United States, I think, is in inner cities. Mike mentioned that I wrote a book about suburbanization and why America became suburban and low density. And this is true. But we are now in the midst, I think, of a beginning of a new shift. And I think the future is going to be much higher density than we have experienced. And I think there are a lot of reasons. One is the environment. High density places are much easier on the earth than low density, if only because you don't have to use cars to drive around everywhere. Even if you don't believe in that, the cost of oil is reminding us always of the cost of our low-density, high automobility lifestyle. And we used to be a rich country. Used to be able to say we were the richest country in the world. I don't think most people think that anymore. And if it's true now, it won't be true soon because we're importing so much oil and we can't afford it. 11, 12 million barrels of oil today, and now it's going to more than $80 a barrel. And then I think especially the attractiveness of the inner city to young people. And this is an editorial. When I was growing up, everybody wanted to, they still do, you want to drive when you're 16 and you want to ride around. But I think increasingly by the time people are 21, 22, they're a little sick of that. They're bored with shopping malls because every shopping mall in the United States is essentially the same. And what we're seeing is delayed marriage. When I was 20, you got married, or 22 to have sex. I don't think many people do that anymore. So now what young people are deciding is they're watching television programs like Sex and the City or Seinfeld and Friends, and they're thinking it's much more sophisticated to eat in an outdoor restaurant, to know what fashions are and stuff like this. So there's a whole group of people who are now want to live in urban environments, and you can see that simply by prices and what's happening in the Chicago Loop and what used to be the South Side, or what's happening in San Francisco or Boston or most of New York City or Georgetown in Washington, the incredibly high prices that's now being paid for to live there. And so in a capitalist society I'm not making this up, a parking place, this is not an ordinary parking place, but a parking place in New York City can now cost you $500,000 just to park. That doesn't include the monthly maintenance, but you wouldn't expect it for such a low price, would you? Anyway, it's great to see so many of you here. I think Nashville is building on its past, its grand architecture, its historic commercial structures, and its musical heritage. And I hope one day it can be said of Nashville, as Samuel Johnson once said of London, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. Thank you. We have to go out of here because I know there's a bus waiting for at least some of you, but I think there may be time for, I know there are many local experts here, and some want to set me straight on many issues, and so, do I have time for one question somewhere? Yes, sir. Okay. By the way, one of the three, listen, I don't know, but the reason I chose Houston was because it shares so many characteristics with New Orleans. In other words, and I would rather go to New Orleans than Houston if you gave me my choice about what I think many of us would. But if you want to get a job, first of all, there are not many jobs in New Orleans, and second of all, if you don't know somebody, especially you're related through 3 or 4 different ways, you're not going to get a job. If you were the chairman of IBM or Nissan, you would have no chance of getting the New Orleans Country Club. None. If you're Jewish, forget about it. Now, I was president of the New York Historical Society. I had to raise millions of dollars. We couldn't care less how long you've been around or what your ethnicity or race are. And you write a check. You want to why New York City is a cultural center? You can buy your way into the elite. Even the Astors were newcomers. The Rockefellers are newcomers. All these people, Sandy Weil, all these people who give money. You have enough money? It takes a while. I don't mean you can just write a check and it happens. But being Jewish doesn't kill you. It did until recently. But in Houston is more or less following that model. And New Orleans is following the other model. Austin is more interesting. Everybody prefers Austin to Houston. But why? Because it's the same way as Honky Tonk Town here, down here. It's a bunch of 6th Avenue and 6th Street. I forget 6th Avenue, 6th Street. Live music. People want to be there. They think it's funky. You know, it's got a wonderful bike paths along the river that looks more like a lake. Austin's got a heck of a lot going for it. Quality of life. That's what they're thinking in Austin, and they're thinking it's better than Houston. Yeah, there we go.
Nashville has a terrible homeless problem, which is rather disconcerting since we have so many wealthy people. And I'm hoping our new Nashville mayor will do something about it.
Well, it's interesting that, homelessness will not be mentioned in the presidential campaign this year. It's one of the first things people from other countries notice. It's a bit rich country, but I noticed there are people sleeping in the doorways around here. My father used to talk to me about China when I was growing up in Memphis. That you could be walking along a Chinese street. I'll still remember there'd be people lying on the street. Good Lord, I can't believe this. Well, now that's the way it is in our country, that we don't care. But if you want to see the serious homeless problem, go to San Francisco. They're everywhere in San Francisco. And that's a public policy decision. I really don't have the answer to it. But it's gotten much better in New York, and that's because they built huge amounts of home. Ed Koch spent more on new shelter for the homeless than the next 50 largest cities in the United States put together. And you can see it. I would like to stand here for a long time. Can I? I don't know. I'm worried about it. Yes, ma'am.
You said you'd like to see New Orleans come back. I'm not sure I agree if it's still under sea level and it's got all these terrible problems. Maybe they are true.
Well, I'm glad I'm not the president of the United States. I'm glad I'm not making that choice because I said I wanted New Orleans to come back, but why should you build a city that's below sea level that happens to be on the ocean, and they have big winds that come through there every now and then. If they could build it to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. Now, they're going to ask you to pay for it, by the way. And if you go to New Orleans, they have signs all over the place, hold the Corps responsible. And they mean the Corps of Engineers. But a lot of that was also the corruption of the city inspectors who passed judgment on those levies that didn't hold. So I think there's enough blame to go around. I just think New Orleans is one of America's unique cities, and I hope that it somehow will go. But you're damned either way. If you build below sea level, you're a fool. If you don't build below sea level, you're a racist because most of the people who live in the lower ninth, and by the way, it's not just African Americans. Lots of others to the east side of New Orleans, all those houses are flooded. And I mean flooded up to the roof. And of course, they're completely lost. And New Orleans is not being rebuilt. And if you saw the statistics in the New York Times yesterday, it compares the disaster in San Diego with the disaster in New Orleans. And they had all sorts of statistics of not only population size, minorities, people who own cars, and stuff like this. And essentially contrasting the response to the two disasters.
That hole will be filled in. We've got mountains and church mountains down here in North Mississippi and southern Tennessee. It would be expensive.
To fill in New Orleans, to raise it up. Okay. Listen, the evidence is some people estimate we've already spent more than $100 billion. That's serious money in New Orleans because of the. And some people would say, just raise it up 10 feet and maybe the problem will go away. But I don't know enough about it to pass judgment on that one. Yeah, somebody's waving back there. Yes. Yes.
You said that the Bronx had a lower homicide rate than Memphis, yet the Bronx had...
The Memphis, Nashville, and New Orleans put together.
Yes, yet the Bronx had a larger population. Do you trust the reporters of the homicide in the Bronx, or are they just put them, drag them under the...
Well, no, listen, I want to take your question. No, I was actually on a panel once with somebody who said that. But most historians say that you cannot trust burglary statistics, rape statistics, robbery statistics, assault statistics because they're underreported. But homicide, they generally feel is like 97% accurate. I mean, it's hard to explain away a bullet in the back of somebody's head or whatever. And by the way, there are two statistics that historians trust. Homicide, and the other is automobile theft. Automobile theft you trust because you cannot deduct it on Schedule B unless you have a police report, and neither can you deduct it, can you get reimbursement from the insurance company. They got to see a police report. So if there's 6 people in front of you, if your purse was stolen or something, you may say, to heck with it. they're not going to do anything about it anyway. But for a car, you're going to wait. However long it takes, you're going to get that written report with a number on it that you can tell your insurance company. So yes, we do trust the homicide statistics. I'm not saying they're never fudged, but generally, mostly we trust them. And that's why I mentioned homicide. That's the only one I trust, homicide and car theft. And the homicide rate in New York is down so much now, the stranger crime is down 90%. That's what we worry about. It's hard to keep the guy from killing his girlfriend he's in bed with, or the drug dealers from killing each other. But stranger crime, which is, somebody you don't know, that's what's almost disappeared. And you can make that happen. The way they did it was by holding it. Well, that's a whole lot. Well, that's a different story. We won't get there. Somebody has to stand up and tell me when to shut up. Okay. Yes?
Comment on the importance of public transportation and the seeming resistance in some regions of the country to not support it?
It's very hard to change our stripes. It really is. Because they're trying. Look at Houston. You saw that skyscrapers were full of parking lots. But Houston has now put a light rail system, which is a trolley, 2 or 3 cars, running from downtown through the Texas Medical Center on out to the edges where the people who work in the Texas Medical Center park. And then services. So even in a spread out city, and Houston is probably more spread out than Nashville, now you have to subsidize it. But we subsidize the car so much you can't believe it. Right here in Tennessee, sure we devote the gasoline taxes to the automobile, 100%. And we could argue about that, but that doesn't cover it. The street outside your house is not paid for by gasoline taxes. It's paid for by income taxes, real estate taxes, and all that kind of stuff. Gasoline taxes don't come close to covering the cost of the automobile. The question is, so here it was stated, in California a bunch of years ago, the California state government, not thought to be unfriendly to the car, this was about 15 years ago, said gasoline costs $5 in California. We ask the motorists to pay $1.25, and the state picks up the other $3.75. That's adding all the cost of the automobile. And so I think we have to subsidize it, which is exactly what the European countries do. And we are the outlier here. All other advanced countries are trying to get people out of their cars just a little bit. We're not saying don't have a car, but just don't drive it every time you want a Pepsi, One more in the corner. Yes, okay. One more. I see you in the corner.
The fact that climate change is here, global warming is a fact. We can't say, one incident is consequence of it. It is here. And cities are going to have to deal with it. How do you address the issue? People are some modernization, the way cities are going to thrive in the future, given that they're
She said we've got, listen, I agree with you. I think it's a fact too, but it's not accepted by everybody, including the president. But so it makes a difference. No, but it's not totally proven. But the other thing is, how do we deal with it? It will not be easy. We have built the lifestyle around, it's not just automobiles, it's great big houses and many other kinds of things. And it'll be slow. But I think that we could recreate, you notice, in Germantown here or other places, I think we really are social animals. And notice how young people crowd into bars even if they don't like to drink or don't even like music. They want to be with each other. Children almost always would prefer, they'd much rather have a 20 by 20 foot swing set in some place with other kids than have a 4-acre yard. The greatest thing ever been pushed on American people is you move to the suburbs for the kids. Kids can't stay in suburbs, especially when you get to be 14 or 15 or 16, their mother's got to take them everywhere. And the reason they go to the malls is that's the only place they can go. I think we can slowly redirect ourselves. The people who want 4 acres or 6 acres for their horse, fine. But so many of us have built yards that are huge and they serve no purpose. Nurture no animals, grow no crops, do nothing but absorb energy. We can move a little closer together and walk to get an ice cream cone and use sidewalks. I think 2 of the greatest things we can do in cities is to get restaurants to put some chairs on the sidewalk. That makes us feel safe. And put up sidewalks so we can walk without being killed as we walk around. I think those 2 things you do. You've been terrific. Thank you very much.